Hey there, it's Jan Ozer. This is always the awkward period when you start the webinar, but you can't really tell if it's starting or not. So let me just jump right in. As the title suggests, this is the webinar on VP9 encoding for live and VOD distribution. And here's our agenda, broken it up into different lessons that facilitates converting it into a course, which is what I'll be doing once I complete this webinar. And we'll start with what VP9 is and where VP9 encoded videos play. And then we'll look at the VP9 encoding configuration options. We'll spend a bunch of time there and spend a bunch of time looking at how VP9 quality compares to HEVC, H.264 AV1, and how much bandwidth VP9 can actually save you if you deploy it. Then we'll look at live, what options are available for encoding and transcoding, and then we'll get to some resources. Now, in the description of the event, I said I would cover dash distribution, didn't get to that topic, so if that's why you came, sorry, and I just didn't get to it. While I'm here, I meant to download or upload my handout, and if I can do it in come on. Okay, I'm uploading the handout now, so that should be available on the right-hand side of your interface. And you see the question mark button on the right-hand side of your interface. If you have any questions, please ask them, and I will check periodically. We don't have a lot of time to spare. We've got 71 slides for 60 minutes, so it's going to be tough to take questions in line, but I will stay until the very end to answer any questions that come up during the presentation. So this is sponsored by the Streaming Learning Center. That's my company where streaming professionals come to learn. And 3 courses that I'm pretty proud of: the live streaming bootcamp that just launched, Derek Freeman's course on WOW as a streaming engine, and then Streaming Media 101. If you're interested in those courses, please check them out. This ends the commercial portion. Let's jump into lesson 1. So what VP9 is and where VP9 encoded videos play. A little bit about VP9. It's an open source codec that's produced by Google. It came from the Onto acquisition that first produced VP8, excuse me, VP8 and WebM. It's supposedly open source and royalty free, but Sysfel launched a VP9 and an AV1 patent pool in 2019. You can read all about that at that bit.ly link. Now, the Sysfel pool applies to consumer hardware devices, not currently software. They're not currently seeking royalties on content. So, if you're a content producer, I don't think the patent pool is going to be relevant to you. And of course, Google disputes these claims, and the resolution of whether or not the royalty will apply isn't clear at this point. Where do VP9 encoded videos play? We'll look at the browser, mobile, and living room. And this is a website called Can I Use? And if you go to caniuse.com and search under VP9, you'll see that it plays in 96.28% of browsers, which is pretty good availability for a codec that's not named H.264. And if you look at the other codecs, you see that H.264 has a slight lead at 98.23. HEVC is down at 18.8%, which makes it a non-starter for anybody targeting video going into browsers. And that, of course, is because the Alliance for Open Media, companies in the Alliance that won't adopt HEVC are, Google with Chrome, Mozilla with Firefox, and Microsoft with Edge. So although Edge does play HEVC in certain conditions, obviously Chrome and Firefox are 2 of the largest browsers out there. Safari does play HEVC on the Macintosh platform. VP9, as I said, is at 96.26. AV1 is coming on strong, so it's at 74.25%. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the competition between VP9 and AV1 during the course of this presentation, because obviously if you're targeting the browser, HEVC is a non-starter. The question is, do you do VP9 now, or do you wait until AV1 has a little bit higher percent? And I think the conclusion will be pretty clear when we get to the end of the presentation. Now, in terms of mobile, getting to that whole choice between AV1 and VP9, this slide is from a talk on the web by JP Chalk's Talks, where the host had David Ronca, as you probably know from Netflix and now with Facebook, talking about the adoption of AV1. And he basically stated that while the Alliance for Open Media was talking about massive hardware integration of AV1 in 2022, the chipsets are not available, and now Ronca is pushing that back into the 2026-2027 timeframe. So if you were thinking you'd have a lot of mobile devices with AV1 decode, you can see the URL on the lower right. You can see the time of Ronca's comments. It just doesn't look like that's going to happen in the short term. So H.264, of course, plays in both the iOS and Android browser. HEVC plays in iOS in the browser, not in Android in the browser. You can play HEVC on both Android and iOS if you create an app for it. Of course, you can do that, with any codec, but you should have hardware support for both. VP9, it's kind of a mess with Mac. It looks like they have added VP9 support. Sometimes I read that it's available only in an app. Sometimes I read it's available in the browser, so I'm not 100% sure. I know you can play YouTube videos with that are encoded with VP9 on iOS devices at this point. And then AV1 is available on iOS devices. And of course, it's not in the browser with Safari on the Mac, but you can use AV1 if you create your own app. VP9 is the preferred format over HEVC for Android browser. And AV1, because of the hardware integration that we saw with the slide from Ronca a minute ago, it's going to have battery life issues. So if you're trying to target a lower bitrate stream to some of these mobile devices, again, if AV1 was coming as quickly as we hoped it would, then AV1 would be a viable alternative before VP9. But it looks like we're going to have to wait a while for that to come. And then, in the SmartTV, OTT, and high dynamic range market, H.264 is available on smart TVs and OTT, but it's not a preferred format for high dynamic range. It's just too efficient. It is possible to do it with Dolby Vision, but again, you'd prefer to use HEVC. Most devices that you're targeting a high dynamic range video to can play HEVC in hardware. HEVC is the preferred format in the living room because of the high dynamic range support. VP9 has good support in both smart TVs and OTT devices, but there's not a lot of support on the high dynamic range. It is capable of 10-bit operation, but you're not seeing a lot of the metadata support that you see with HEVC and standards like HDR10 and 10 Plus and Dolby Vision. And then AV1, we're seeing a lot of, some hardware support in newer smart TVs that were launched in 2021 timeframe, but that's still a very, very tiny number in terms of installed base of support, and still not seeing, again, it's fully capable of 10-bit support, but I'm not seeing the metadata support that you see with HEVC and some of the HDR formats that are out there. So, if you're going to the living room, unless you don't want high dynamic range, HEVC is the format you're probably going to use. So summarizing this particular section, I don't think the sysvel pool is going to be a deterrent for content producers. The sweet spot for VP9, if it can deliver the goods, reduce your bandwidth cost or improve quality of experience, appears to be in browser-based playback, and that's what JW Player does, and that's an online video platform that's implemented VP9, or to download directly to mobile devices, which is what Netflix is doing, or non-HDR content to the living room, to the extent that you're targeting the living room and you don't have high dynamic range videos. So now let's look at the VP9 encoding options, and we'll talk a little bit more about the fact that VP9 is a standard, it's not a codec. There are codec implementations of the standard, and the implementation that we're going to be working through in this case is the implementation of FFmpeg, also available if you directly download the VP9 codec from the Alliance for Open Media. We'll see at the end of this what the encoding interfaces look like for AWS MediaConvert and Amazon Elastic Transcoder, and it looks nothing like what we're going to talk about. Basically, there's no controls at all. You just choose the data rate, gop size, the typical stuff. None of the specifics that we're going to be covering in this section apply to other codecs. So this is going to be FFmpeg specific for the most part. And we'll work through the various options pretty quickly. I'll show you the methodology that I used. We'll finalize the string, and then we'll use that string to compare it to Google's recommendations, and then encodes using AWS MediaConvert and Amazon Elastic Transcoder. Wanted to create, go through my analysis, figure out the best encoding ladder for VP9, and then test it against other implementations that are out there or other suggested configurations that are out there. So here's the baseline starting point, the most basic encoding string that you can use and still get, the gop size that you want and the bitrate control that you want. And with the VOD encoding, I use 200% constrained VBR in all the encodes that I did, both the ones in this particular module and the ones where I compared VP9 with H.264, HEVC, and AB1. So no surprises here. If you know FFmpeg, you choose the codec, first pass, target bit rate is 2500 kilobits per second. This is a 30 frame per second file, so the gop size is 60, minimum keyframe interval is 60, and then then you go to the second pass, add a little bit more detail, and we wanted the target bit rate to be 2500, max rate 5 megabits per second. Keyframe interval was 60, and then we named the file. So that's, if you know FFmpeg, this is as simple as it gets. The most important thing you do when you choose, when you encode a video file with VP9 or any codec is choose a preset. And there are 5 presets that are implemented in the VP9 codec in the FFmpeg implementation. And what I did here was I encoded using all 5 presets a bunch of test files, and then I measured the encoding time, which is plotted out in red, the low frame VMAF score, and the low frame VMAF score gives you a measure of the likelihood of getting transient quality problems, and then average VMAF score, which is in blue. And then, I tried to figure out where the most commercially optimal preset would be, and then I encoded with that. So if you encoded speed 4, you encode in 15% of the encoding time of speed 0. But the quality down here, particularly the low frame quality, is a bit sketchy. You may not get the quality that you need, even though the encoding time is good. All the way over here, if you go to qualities, if you go to speed 0, you get very, very little increase in VMAF or low frame VMAF, but you're going from 44% to 100%. So you're going, 150% of your encoding time. So basically, what I came to was that speed 2 was the preset I wanted to test at, because it gives you a 30% jump in encoding time, but you get a 2.2 VMAF score jump from speed 3, and that's in the low frame, and then a 1.18 jump in the average VMAF. Those aren't great numbers, but it's much bigger than what you get when you go from speed 2 to speed 1, which gives you a 47% jump in encoding time. So it's important to remember that this preset controls both quality and encoding time, and we're going to see why that's important when we compare to MPEG 2. I'm sorry, MPEG 2. Showing my age here. When we compare to HEVC, H.264, and AB1. So the next decision I had to make was, we're going to choose speed 2 for the second pass, and it's generally well recognized that you can encode at any speed for the first pass and it doesn't impact quality. So I wanted to test that, so I tested with speed 4 in the first pass and speed 2 in the second pass, and then speed 2 in the first pass and speed 2 in the second pass. And this is the analysis that we're going to see throughout all the encoding parameters that I tested. I tested 2 files, Freedom and Football, and these are 10-second clips, and they're 10 seconds because when you're doing a lot of tests, it takes a lot of time, and these are the clips I used to encode with AV1, and that takes a heck of a lot of time. So these are 10-second clips, and then you see the alternatives up here. These are the ones that I tested. Again, in both cases, I used speed 2 in the second pass. In one case, I used speed 4, in the other, I used speed 2, and the question was there any difference in either quality or encoding time? And what we saw was that the files are exactly the same in terms of the bit rate. The speed first pass was slightly faster, speed 4 first pass was slightly faster. VMAF scores were the same, low frames were the same, and standard deviation. So I would encode the files using the different parameters that are noted in each column, and then I would check average VMAP, low frame VMAP, and standard deviation, which measures the variability of VMAP score in the encoded file. And in this case, we're seeing there's really no quality difference, or time difference, and no file size difference. So I'm going to feel comfortable going 4 in the first pass. Gives me really no difference in the file. It doesn't matter what you use in the first pass, you're going to get the same quality as the preset that you use in the second pass determines. And here's the updated command string, and we'll see the updated command string every time we make a change to the command string with the new command in bold. The next issue was the switch for min rate. And if you go to a lot of the recommended strings out there, including Google's, they recommend adding the minimum rate to the maximum rate and the target bit rate. And I wanted to see what that did to quality, what that did to all the other parameters that I was checking. And what we saw was that it doesn't really change the encoding time. It increases it by, on average around 9 seconds. But what we see is that it increased the file size by 11%. Now that 11% did increase the VMAP score, the low frame score, and the standard deviation, but I knew I was going to be doing a lot of file comparisons, so really accuracy was very important to me. Otherwise I'd have to check the file size every time encoded with VP9. So bottom line was, if I was producing VP9 in the field, I would probably experiment with this switch in there to see how much it boosted bit rate across my encoding ladder across all forms of content that I produced. But in the lab experiment that I was doing, I decided not to do it. Not a huge deal either way. I just felt that bit rate accuracy was most important here rather than the absolute quality that it delivered. Threads is the number of threads assigned to the encode. Here what I tried was, baseline. When I didn't include the switch, that's the baseline. What's performance like? 1 thread, 4 threads, 8 threads, 16 threads. Orange is always the worst, green is always the best, and we see very little difference in terms of any of the file parameters, no matter what you use for threads. And when I was writing my book 3 or 4 years ago, I asked Google engineers about this, and they said, yeah, threads doesn't impact quality. It just gives you the control you need if you're trying to use VP9 in a highly optimized encoding environment. So if you go to 1 thread, you see the encoding time increases substantially, but if you use 1 thread, you should be able to get 8 VP9 encodes going at the same time, but if you use 8 threads, you could only use 1. So most producers that I know, whether they're running encoding farms or whether they're running software on their desktop, are going to do 1 or 2 encodes at the same time. So I went with 8 threads because I think that's the most common. It gives you a pretty good encoding time on the computers I was using as my test bed, and obviously there's no quality or any kind of file difference at all. Here's the updated command string. What about quality? There are 3 quality settings. There's good, there's best, and then there's real time. Real time is only in place when you're using 1 pass. So what does best give you? Best increases the encoding time by 656%. It does boost the file size a bit, gives you, 2 VMAP points higher quality, substantially higher low frame quality, which is pretty alluring, and a little bit lower standard deviation. The problem is, it's going to cost you 650x encoding time. So I pretty much thought that most people wouldn't go for that, so I decided to stay with good. Now, good is the default setting here. So in the command string, I'm showing this in green, which is basically my way of telling myself that if I'm comparing this encoding string to another, say Google's or to someone else's encoding string, if they have good in there and I don't, because I have good in green, I know, okay, that's the default. If they don't have good, I know that they're going to get the same result as I did because that's the default setting. They don't need to include it. Tile columns is an obscure setting that splits the video image into columns and rows. This is the language that you see in the FFmpeg help file. I tried various settings, and for this 1080p file, what I found was that 4 gives me a faster encoding time without any significant decrease in quality. So going forward, I use the setting of 4. And then we see this here, tiles columns. We see this in green for reasons I said before. alt reference frames, enable alternate reference frames or not, enable or disable this, and then set the number. What I found here, I tried, the baseline is no setting, -1, +1, +2, +4, +6. I found that -1 gave me the best overall quality and, upon average, and that's the one I use going forward. It also hit the data rate target, which is, which some of these over here did not do. Lag-in frames, here I'm trying to figure out what the best setting is for lag-in frames. The default setting according to FFmpeg is -1. I tested 1, 8, 16, and 25. And what I found was that lag-in frame settings of 25 delivered just about the best encoding time, or lag-in frames 1 delivered the best encoding times, but we had the best overall quality, the best low frame quality, and the best standard deviation. So what does it look like in lag-in frames 1? This is the Moscow State University visualization tool. And what we're seeing here is the lag-in frames of 25 is in red, lag of frames of 1 is in green, and this gives me the ability to track the score over the duration of the 10-second encoded file. And if you check the quality of this frame, this is the source frame, this is the lag-in frames 25, this is lag-in frames 1. So lag-in frame 1 gives you much faster encoding time, but also gives you the ability to have transient quality issues like this one, which is why I went with lag-in frames 25. Frame parallel is a parameter that helps decode efficiency. Decode efficiency didn't appear to be a significant problem when I tested it, but I tested all files with this enabled. So baseline, set it at 0 to disable it, set it to 1. And what I learned is that, it did drop the quality slightly from 87.93 to 87.73, but if it's going to help decode efficiency, and you may be deciding to deploy on mobile devices where that might matter, then it seemed like a good investment to use frame parallel 1, even if it was going to degrade quality only very slightly. And this is another one that its default setting is 1, so you don't need to include it to have it work, and that's why it's in green. ROMT is a parameter that gives you multi-threading on the encode. There was some talk about a drop in quality, so I wanted to test, what is the increase in encoding speed, what is the drop in quality that I need to worry about. And what we see is that ROMT 0 with ROMT disabled, we have, everything is in orange, which tells me that's the worst option. And we see encoding speed drop from 212, average of 2 files, to 124. So we get a pretty significant 58% increase in encoding speed. And we see the drop in, we see minimal impact on the bit rate. We see that ROMT actually delivers higher quality. And then the low frame is minimally changed, and then it actually delivers the highest standard deviation or the lowest standard deviation. So ROMT is a good alternative that I included in my baseline encode. Last, I wanted to check and see if tuning would matter. So with the encodes that I did for H.264, HEVC, I tuned to get optimal results with the VMAF metric that I was using. I wanted to see if either of the tuning options for VP9 boosted the quality there. PSNR seemed to do nothing. SSIM degraded scores, so I just went with no tune. And this is the final command string. So let's check my work. And you go through this analysis, you try and understand what the parameters do, and you try and build the incredible command string that's going to blow everything out the water. And then you run the tests. And here's what you see. So here's the Google recommendations, and the concerns I have here is Google includes both CRF and bitrate control. And if you know anything about CRF encoding, constant rate factor encoding, it's a measure of quality. And typically with CRF, the codec varies the data rate to meet the CRF quality. So if you have both the data rate and a CRF value, which is going to control. So that's confusing to me, and I ran some tests that are available online that showed even, if you change the CRF value from 21 to 41, which is a huge quality difference, it's not going to change the output significantly because the data rate is the controlling factor. So I would just leave it out. Note that YouTube is using, or Google is using speed 4 in the second pass. So what's that going to do? That's going to increase encoding speed but decrease quality somewhat. And they implemented the min rate. So they're using min rate that I didn't implement because, again, it didn't. My files weren't hitting the target that I wanted to hit. So their GOP was 240, which is 8 seconds. I changed that to 60 for my test to get the files as close as I could in terms of parameters. They do not use ROMT in their encode, and certainly that's something. If I was going to start with the Google parameters, I would definitely add ROMT, and I would definitely change to speed 2 in the second pass. So what do we come up with? This is baseline. This is the encoding string that I came up with, and here's Google's command string, and they were faster. No surprise there. They were speed 4 in the second pass. They were a little bit smaller on the file size. They were a little bit lower on the VMAF score. It's actually 1.4 VMAF points, and then they were also a bit higher on the low frame score, and they were a bit higher on the standard deviation. But there's not any huge change here. If I was going to use the Google recommendations, I would use speed 2 for the second pass. I would add ROMT to kind of offset that speed decrease, and then I would drop the CRF, and I'm sure their parameters would be their output quality would be very, very close to what I came up with. And then I tested against AWS Elemental MediaConvert, and these are all the parameters you get. I mean, basically you choose the buffer size, the target bit rate, and the max bit rate, and that's it. You get none of the ROMT, alternate alt refrains, that kind of stuff, none of that. And what I found with and this is a 2-minute test file, and I only tested one. The quality is about the same. The low frame score is about the same. The standard deviation. Our command string was a bit lower, but that's just one test file. I wouldn't use that to say that MediaConvert doesn't do a fine job with encoding VP9. And then elastic transcoder, I was really hoping to blow that up, but pretty much the same thing. There's not a lot of parameters for VP9. And there wasn't a lot of quality difference or file size difference between the output. So it really appears that there's no magic bullet with libvpx VP9 encoding. Again, this is the VP9 codec that's in FFmpeg. And that's assuming what AWS Elemental and what Amazon are using is the libvpx codec. Now, Elemental is famous for creating their own codecs. I couldn't tell from the file if they used libvpx or created their own. Either way, there were no major breakthroughs in their codecs. Now, there are different codec implementations. There's a company called Twin Orioles that has the VP9 codec that I believe Netflix is using, and they may deliver additional quality that we're not seeing from libvpx, but none of the commercial implementations I could access and none of the command strings that I could copy, like Google's, delivered substantially different quality than what I came up with after days and days of testing. Okay, so that's how to encode VP9 with FFmpeg. Now we're going to see how the quality compares to MPEG-2's out, to H.264, HEVC, and AV1. And just for anybody who didn't download the handout, I'm showing the handout as uploaded and ready for download. Let me check that. Yeah, there is a handout. If you click the bottom, just underneath the question mark on the right-hand side, you'll see the VP9 experiments, so you can download that now. We're going to be showing a lot of data. We already showed a lot of data, so I recommend you downloading them. Okay, how VP9 quality compares to H.264, HEVC, and AV1. Now, here's where I do the spiel about codecs versus standards. Standards like H.264, HEVC, and to a certain extent VP9 and AV1, any company can write their own codec to. So codecs are specific implementations of that standard, and that's why I was so careful to say that VP9 that we were talking about on the configuration side was libvpx-VP9, which is available in FFmpeg. So this is a chart from an MSU report, Moscow State University, and what we see is that there are multiple implementations of many of these codecs that show different quality. So, here's X.264 over here, here's X.265, but we see many or several HEVC encoders that deliver the same quality at a lower bit rate. Same thing with AV1, same thing, I think, with VP9, though Twin Orioles is not represented here. So I can only, the reason I tested FFmpeg was because I had access to the codec. I asked Twin Orioles if they wanted to allow me to test their codec. They said no. About the 5th time I've asked, they said no. But Netflix is using it, so I'm sure it delivers. I guess my point is most people are going to implement FFmpeg because it's cheapest and simplest. So I think my results are valid, but they don't show necessarily the best of the best because I didn't have access to the best. I just had access to what's in FFmpeg. I think the X.264 codec in FFmpeg is about the best, but the other codecs are clearly not so. Okay, the command strings. If you go to this article here, AV1 has arrived comparing codecs from AO Media, Vision UR, and Intel Netflix. You'll see this URL, and that's where I explain the encoding strings I use for AV1, for X.264, and for X.265. And I want to note that here I use CPUs 3, which is kind of the same as we did with VP9. We looked at the encoding time versus the quality levels, and that just seemed like the most reasonable. That's covered in the article. And then we use very slow for X.264 and X.265. And very slow for X.265 turned out to be very, very slow. And here we are. So here's the encoding time. And what I did was I encoded 3 files on 3 different machines. This is an i7-based machine. This is a Xeon-based machine. And this is a dual Xeon machine with 48 cores, and the average time for X.264 was 56 seconds, X.265 was 1125 or 12x X.264. I mean, that's outrageous, right? VP9 in the configuration that we used was 1 minute 57, which is 2x or 6 times quicker than X.265, which was startling. And AV1 was, as expected, about 17 to 18 times X.264, very slow preset. So X.265 looks high, but then I went back to some of the tests that I've done in the past, and this was on August 31st, 2018 in Streaming Media Magazine. You can see the URLs here and here, and these are seconds. So X.264 very slow was 289 seconds. Okay, I believe I have these reversed. I do. So this is X.265, this is X.264. So X.265 took 16x X.264, which isn't that far from what we're seeing here. On September 18th, 2020, I ran the same test. Again, these are reversed, but X.265 very slow was about 13x X.264 very slow. And today what we're talking about is 11.8x X.265 versus X.264. So, X.265 has been relatively consistent vis-a-vis X.264 for a long time. The issue is typically with the VP9 encoding parameters. When I tested VP9 back in August of 2018, I used preset 0, which, as we saw, increased encoding time significantly without delivering substantial additional quality. So I think there's a general perception that VP9 is slow to encode, but as you compare it to X.265 very slow, that's certainly not the case. Now, if you go X.265 slow or medium, you'll of course produce a much faster speed, but that's where I started. And with X.265 medium, the quality was substantially behind VP9. And it struck me that it was, I was kind of damned if I do or damned if I don't, but it struck me to, most people would spend more money to encode the highest possible quality or highest reasonable quality for X.265 if they were going to implement it. Could be wrong. Spoke to a friend who runs an encoding farm, for a commercial encoding farm, and he said some people use X.265 at very slow, some people use it at medium, there's just a range. So, and same thing with X.264. So I didn't want to do, you'll see that the encoding requirements for this webinar were quite substantial. I didn't want to add to it by doubling and doing both, medium and very slow for X.264 and X.265. Anyway, X.265 looked startlingly high at first, but I think it's pretty reasonable, or it's pretty much in line with what we saw in the past. Okay, so we talked about, so here I am, and I'm trying to figure out, what I'm trying to reliably represent is how much bandwidth and how much quality improvement VP9 can deliver over X.264. Now, I tested with 8 or 9 different files, and the problem is every file encodes differently, right? That's the whole per title thing. So what I wanted to do was come up with the optimal encoding configuration for X.264, and then come up with the optimal encoding configuration for VP9, H.265, and AV1, and then compare those. And I couldn't do that if I used the same encoding ladder for all the files, and I couldn't do that if I used the same encoding ladder for each codec for each file. So what I did, and this is the well-known Netflix convex Hull analysis, is I encoded the clips, and these were 10-second versions in this case, to multiple resolutions, that's on top, multiple data rates over here on the left. And then this is a Google Sheet, and I recorded the VMAF scores all throughout here, and then this is the maximum value, and then I use conditional formatting to say, what's the maximum value of all the resolutions that are represented in the sheet. So I started the encoding ladder for every codec at the data rate where the codec first reached 95, under the assumption that quality beyond 95 is probably not going to be visible by anybody. And that's if you went to 98 or 99, it's going to be wasted bandwidth. So started every encoding ladder for every clip for every codec at 95, multiplied that by 0.6. That's to get, Apple recommends a jump between encoding rungs of between 1.5 and 2x. 0.6 gives you that. And then I went down and, I highlighted it because I was doing this all manually because couldn't figure out how to program it. And this is the first clip here. 0.6 gives you 3,400 or close to 3,400. 0.6 gives you 2. 0.6 gives you 1.2. 0.6 gives you 700. And I repeated until the data rate was 300 kilobits per second or lower. So this is H.264 for this particular clip, which is a pretty demanding clip. And then I repeated with each codec to produce the optimal ladder for each codec. And then I rinsed and repeat and did it with When I talked about substantial encoding requirements, there was a lot of work, but I couldn't think of any other way. VP9 needs a different ladder to really optimally be compared to H.264, as does AV1, as does X.265. And you see that here. I mean, this is H.264 or X.264 codec specifically, and we see that the highest quality was at 1080p up until, for this particular clip, up until 3.4 megabits per second. With X.265, the highest quality, 1080p was the highest quality until it came down to 1200. So again, not only do you need to use different data rate values, you need to change which resolutions you use within the encoding ladder. So again, I started with the first bit rate that exceeded 95 VMAF score, 0.6, 0.6, 0.6, drew my lines, added those to the encoding ladder, and did the computation. Here's what VP9 looked like. This was able to push the encoding ladder all the way down with the 1080p rung all the way down to here. AV1, same deal. AV1 couldn't meet the data rate here. That's why there's no scores here. So the lesson, a couple of lessons there. Most importantly, different encoding ladder for each clip and different encoding ladder for each codec implementation that you do for that clip. And this brought me to this analysis here. So, so here's what the encoding ladder look like plotted in this rate distortion graph. Blue is always going to be H.264, red is X.265, green is VP9, and purple is AV1. And I have to say, all my work really seemed to make AV1 look like the best alternative. AV1 really did well in these clips in a lot of ways. So I looked at multiple clips. Animals is a harmonic test clip. Carlot is a clip I downloaded a while back to create a big test suite, and it's very, very detail oriented. It's very hard clip to encode. Football, another harmonic clip, pretty classic sports clip. Freedom is a music video. Hockey is sports. Meridian is the famous Netflix clip. Sintel is an animation, wanted to make sure I tested animation. And Tears of Steel, another movie-like clip. And download this. We don't need to go over the specific findings for each clip here. I wanted to point out in this particular, so what we're seeing here is that, these are the BD rate numbers. And if you read BD rate, it basically says, okay, VP9 can produce the same quality as X.264 at a bit rate reduction of 28.62%. The same quality as X.265 at a bit rate reduction of 7.8%. And what's interesting is that when we look at the highest quality clip necessary to get to 95, VP9 is weak because it had to extend far out beyond X.265 to achieve the 95 target level. Now, this is where the bandwidth savings are the greatest. Now, down here, X.265 starts to falter and VP9 does well, but there's no bandwidth savings down here, as I'll cover in a moment. So even though VP9 was better than X.265 in this case, it varied over the encoding ladder, and that makes a huge difference when you start to analyze the benefits to you, because it depends on where people are actually retrieving your files. More on that in a second. And here's the summary. And I just wanted to cover, this lesson kind of came home to me when I was doing this analysis just a few minutes ago. And so what does BD rate say? When we look at, VP9 versus X.264, it says that on average over the entire test area, VP9 can produce the same quality as X.264 at a 24.48% lower bit rate. So here's the entire test area, and between, this difference between green and blue, everywhere in that, VP9 can produce the same quality at about a bit rate of that's 24% less. The problem is when you come down here, say if we picked a file here, we picked this encoding ladder rung here. Let's say this is at this is 500 kilobits per second. Now, if I download 500 kilobits per second here, or download 500 kilobits per second here with H.264, I'm not saving any bandwidth, because in one case, I'm downloading a 640 by 360 file, say for H.264. The other is a 720p file with VP9. The VP9 might be better quality, but I'm not saving any bandwidth. So there's two different things happening here. BD rate says at any given point you're going to save this much, but the reality is, as long as you're not on the top rung, you're not going to save anything. You may increase, and you probably will increase, the quality of experience, but you're not going to achieve bandwidth savings. And that's the key difference between what we're seeing here and what we're going to see in the next couple of slides. So this would say, hey, let me implement VP9 because I'll save 24%. That's great, let's do it. But this is the analysis that kind of disprove that notion. And I want to, kind of highlight the point I made before. VP9 is weak here. So if you're distributing all your files up here and you're comparing X.265 and VP9, you're not going to save anything, even though the BD rate tells you that at any point in the ladder, you should be 3% better than X.265. If you're down here, you're going to increase quality of experience, but again, there's no bit rate savings. Okay, beating a dead horse here. So what did I do here? This top rung is H.264. The bottom rung is VP9. And this percentage here is the allocation of streams that are actually being retrieved by viewers, and this is from your server logs. So here we're saying that 50% are viewing your top quality stream, 25% next quality, and so on. So what does that mean? That means that the weighted average bit rate is this number here. You multiply the bit rate times 50% to get here. The weighted average VMAF, same deal. You multiply 95.5, and this is the weighted average VMAF and bit rate for this distribution. And then what I did is I used the new encoding ladder, and this is the overall encoding ladder that I computed by averaging all the scores from all the clips. And we apply, we had to allocate some of these because there were data rate differences between the rungs. But if we do the same analysis here with this distribution, we see that the average bit rate that we distributed goes from 2935 to 2803, which is only 11% savings. We get an increase in VMAF score of 1, but again, because any clip below the top clip doesn't deliver a bandwidth saving, we get much less than what the BD rate would suggest. Here, this is a HDTV or a IPTV case where you've got cable to the home. 100% of the clips get delivered at this rate, and we see the maximum possible savings between VP9 and H.264 because we're harvesting all the savings in the top quality rung, and that's the 15% number here, and minimal quality difference. Again, I started all the encoding ladders at 95, so there was, in some cases there was a small difference there, not meaningful. And then here, this is a more middle-centric clip where we see a lot more of the distribution down here. Now, because there's so little distribution in the top clip, there's very, very little bandwidth savings. Now, there is a 2 VMAF jump here, but that's not inspiring when it comes to implementing a new codec. Now, I'm saying this is preliminary because I really did finally get everything together a couple of hours ago. Anybody has any comments about this? You've got my my email address on the title slide. Please send me your comments and I'll revise it and then publish any revisions. But we're seeing a fundamental difference between what BD rate is supposed to do and what the average savings truly will be if you implement a new codec. And then here's HEVC. And what's interesting, because HEVC did a better job here. So here's HEVC at the top end, not so much at the bottom end. And here's AB1. We see a much higher savings here, here, and here. And that's because it's more efficient, certainly in this case, because 100% of that particular rung is being retrieved. This one's more okay, lost my mouse. Okay, this one's more okay, where would you be if you were my mouse? Okay, so here's AV1. And what we're seeing here is at the 3 distribution ladders that or the 3 distribution patterns that we talked about, we see a 31% bandwidth savings with a VMAF uplift of 4.39. At the top rung, we see the maximum bandwidth savings, but very little VMAF difference because we started the encoding ladder for all the codecs at 95, and then on the extreme right, with a more middle-centric, we see a substantial savings of 16%, but we see very substantial VMAF uplift of almost 7 VMAF points. So other things you're gonna consider when you're considering implementing a new codec. This is on an i7 based computer, percentage of real time. What we're seeing is we got 15.4x real time for X.264, X.265 was much slower, VP9 was very efficient, and AV1 was much slower even than X.265. So again, we talked about the fact if you want to distribute to mobile that are underpowered platforms or maybe underpowered platforms, here's where you might want to consider VP9 as compared to as compared to AV1 because it is going to consume a lot more battery life. On the other hand, I did this analysis on the same computer. Here we see the, this is in the, forget what the application's called, but we tracked the CPU usage. We see H.264 is minimal, H.265 is a little higher, VP9 is more efficient than HEVC, AV1 is higher, but we're still talking about between 10 and 20% of overall CPU usage on an i7. Now that's an i7, it's not an iPhone 12, but still none of these numbers look particularly scary when it comes to deploying, certainly on a computer and maybe even on most newer mobile devices. Options for live, look at origination and transcoding. There's very few standalone hardware encoders for VP9. You can achieve a single stream from a reasonable computer with FFmpeg, and you can see some recommendations on the encoding string at that URL. Hardware support for encoding is available from NVIDIA and Intel, but it's not something that they push, and it's not something that I've seen tested extensively. Transcoding side, once you get the stream into the cloud, how can you transcode it? Nimble Streamer from SoftVellum and Wowza Streaming Engine and Wowza Streaming Cloud all support VP9 transcoding. They seem to do it primarily in software, not in hardware. The NG-codec was a FPGA acceleration company that was bought by Xilinx maybe 2 years ago, and I tested their hardware when they were still NG-codec, and it performed very well. And Twitch ultimately used their hardware, and they found, as you can see, a pretty significant rate savings from the NG-codec hardware. I called Xilinx when I started doing this webinar, and they said, we don't sell it to anybody but Twitch. So it's great, but you can't buy it. If you look at Intel SVT VP9, this is also from Moscow State University report, and what we see is that SVT VP9, which is hardware accelerated via Intel processors, is actually behind X.264. So that obviously is a non-starter. Now I will point out that Wowza appears to be, Wowza is a great tool for transcoding in the cloud. They appear to be software only. I could be wrong on that. I checked their documentations. That's what I saw. But if you're going to be doing VP9 transcoding, I would take it another step. And Nimble Streamer, same thing. I think they actually say no hardware support, it's just FFmpeg. So looking at FFmpeg transcoding, here's the command string I used for VP9. This is from the URL you see below. Here's the command string I used for X.264. And I did that to match the data rate because, as you see here, the data rate that VP9 targeted was very different from what they actually achieved. And the target is on the left, actual is in the middle, and we see substantial overages just didn't hit the target bit rate, which was actually, obviously pretty frustrating when you're trying to test or even produce. And there was a consulting project I did in December where I tested 12 clips, some SD, some HD, and VP9 real-time encoding missed the target bit rate by an average of 90% over the clips that I tested. So this seems to be a pretty pervasive problem. And there's also substantial resources needed to produce the clips themselves. So for those particular tests that I did, the encoding cost or transcoding cost for VP9 was about 4x H.264, which is online with HEVC. It's not onerous, but HEVC gave us results that were more usable. How's the quality compare? When I changed the X.264 encode to meet the data rates achieved by the VP9 encode, it looked promising at 3500, where VP9 was about 3 VMAF points higher than X.264, but over the entire encoding ladder, VP9 was actually a little bit lower than X.264. You don't implement a new codec to get less quality than the codec you're already using. And then, as I said, the same consulting project had pretty much the same results. VP9 did not appear to be a good starter for any of the applications that they were looking at. So the live conclusions, origination, there's not a lot of options out there for VP9. You can do it with a computer and FFmpeg. It feels unlikely that there's going to be a lot of innovation in new hardware for VP9 because I think everybody's pointing towards AV1, and rightfully so. Software encoding is an option. I know NVIDIA supports it. I think Intel results didn't seem good from what the University of Moscow said, but NVIDIA may be promising. I just couldn't get to testing there. Transcoding side, once you get the video up into the cloud, the NG codec, now Xilinx hardware works very well, but it's not available. Software is inefficient, has trouble meeting the target bit rate. And the quality over the entire ladder was just below X.264, and that's what I achieved in tests that I've referred to a couple times now. So NVIDIA-based transcoding may be an option, but that's not something I was able to test for this presentation. So for VOD, it just doesn't appear to deliver the real-world bandwidth savings necessary to deploy unless you just have massive, massive scale. So unless you're on par with Netflix or Amazon or YouTube or who am I forgetting? It just seems like you really should start looking at AV1 rather than VP9. The encoding time, there were bright spots. The encoding time was very competitive. Decoding CPU was very competitive as well. But if you're going to look at VP9, you want to implement it to get the decode support, that's available in browsers and some mobile devices. I would tell you to look at another codec, not the one in FFmpeg. And then live just seemed problematic as well. And we just kind of went over that. There's few hardware encoders, transcoding is inefficient and expensive. So, it's spent a lot of time getting to know VP9, and I did, absent another alternative like what we see from Twin Orioles, I'm just not sure it was a good. I'm not sure it was a good investment. So that's kind of where we ended up. Let me see if there's any questions. I kind of lost my mouse. Let's see if I can unplug and. Okay, I don't have a mouse, so. Oh, here we go. Okay, got a mouse. Any questions? Okay, what do you know about the Twin Orioles codec? Again, I know that Netflix uses it. I've heard figures between 5 and 15%, and other than that, they just, I've asked a couple times to test it because I figured this would become an issue, and they just haven't been willing to let me have a look. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not having a good mouse day. Okay, I'm sorry. The Alistair, I saw your question, but I can't open it up. Can't open any of the questions. So let me just call it. Listen, I appreciate you coming. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. The email address, the best one for me is this one here. If you didn't download the handout, send them an email and I will make sure to get it to you. Thank you for coming, and I'll let you know when the next webinar will be. We'll have something probably in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Thanks for coming. Hope you enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. Take care.